Welcome to part 9 in this series of videos where we look at Blazor WebAssembly from a beginner's perspective. In this video, we look at data validation and duplicates again. Let's look at the project so far. It's our job as developers to protect the user from themselves. Given the opportunity, they will attempt to enter ridiculous data unless we prevent it. What could the inventive user do with our project as it is? First thing they can do when adding a record is simply not to enter any data, and it saves it. We enter more data. We can save that, which is fine, but we can find that we can enter it again. The same city, with or without a population. Let's try another. We can save a city with a negative population. And we've got no constraint on the number of letters in the city name. So if I type something ridiculously long, I can save that. In this case, the database isn't checking. I'm using SQLite, but had we been using, for example, Microsoft SQL Server, the column might have a limit and we might get an error at this point. So we can see that we've got a couple of things that we need to sort out here. Blank names, names that are too long, duplicate records, and records with negative populations. We ought to put a range on that so we don't get somebody entering a population with 10 billion in it, for example. Time to look at the code. We can add business rules as part of the logic of the city's save method, and we will be doing this for checking for duplicates. But we can also achieve a lot of what is required by using the inbuilt data validation offered by Data Annotations. This is pretty simple and has just two basic steps. Firstly, editing the data model, and then editing the data entry form. So we'll have a look at the data model. So if we go to the shared folder and open City CS, we can decorate the columns or fields where we need some validation by giving them some attributes. But first of all, before we do that, we must add a using statement at the top to tell the system to use data annotations. So we just add this using statement here. Then we add the various attributes. So city name, we don't want to leave that blank, but we should limit the number of characters to, say, 50. We also want a meaningful error message to be displayed if the user forgets to enter a name or enters a name longer than 50 characters. To do that, I'm just going to paste in some code here. And to make it easier to understand, I'm going to put a blank line in there. So we have two attributes. We say that the field is required, and the error message is going to be a city name is required. And we're going to say a string length has got a maximum of 50 and a minimum length of 3. And the error message is name must be more than 3 and no less than 50 characters. In the case of the population column, it makes sense to place a reasonableness test to this, checking that it is, say, less than 25 million. To add this restriction, we add the following attributes to the city population field. So we say it's required, and we enter a range is the attribute here, with a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 25 million, and then with a message saying a population must be less than 25 million. There are lots of other attributes, or there are some other attributes that we could use. They're not required in this particular case, but I'll put them in here just to show what is available. And I've commented them all out so they won't have any effect. I've used string length here with a maximum and minimum, but we could have two separate attributes, one for minimum length and one for maximum length. You could use either of these if you didn't want a limit with a minimum and maximum. There's an attribute that will check that an entry is a valid URL. We can also check for email addresses and credit card numbers, and that's basically something that's 16 digits long. I will put a link in the description and in a slide at the end of this presentation that will give the URL of a useful resource I found in this respect. Save the project, and we'll now have a look at the index page. The changes needed to the index page are equally simple. In the dialog box, under the Edit Form tag, we need to use a statement that will tell it to use the data validation or data annotations. So that just says Data Annotations Validator, and it's a self-closing. And then we need to place the messages. And we've got two messages, one for the city and one for the population. We can place these anywhere on the form, but I'm going to place them immediately underneath the relevant text boxes. So for the city, I'm going to place the message here. And for population, I'm going to put that underneath. And the structure of this is simply validation message for, and then a lambda expression for the field name, and the same here. That should be all that's required. So I'll save it and let's just test it. So I'll select a country and I'll try adding a city, and I'll leave it blank. And it says a city name is required. I'll try again, and I'm going to give it a very long name. That should be more than 50 characters. And it says the name must be more than 3 and no less than 50 characters. So that's good. If I try just calling it, giving it one letter, I get the same error message. So far, so good. If I try giving it a population of minus a number, I get an error message that forbids me from doing that. In hindsight, maybe we should say that the population must be more than 0, but less than 25 million. But let's try entering 30 million. And we get the same error message. So I think we've covered those aspects. We can't enter silly data in here, but we can still enter duplicates. So let's have a look at that. To prevent duplicate cities being created, we will count the number of cities already in the database with the same name before we permit an insert or update. Here we're talking about cities for a particular country, so we'll also need to take the country into account. If there's already a city in the database with that name, we will prevent the insertion or update and then display a warning to the user. This is the same technique we use for preventing duplicate countries. And the place we're going to make the change is on the cities save method. So I'll just go down to that. And at the moment, if the cities add edit, city ID is 0, we know it's an insert, otherwise it's an update. So what we can do here is, let me just put some dummy code in here. I'm going to replace that with this. So what we're going to do is check for duplicates, and I'm creating a variable, or will create a variable called count of existing cities. And if that's 0, we'll carry on and do the insert. and we need to establish what that count of existing cities is. So we'll need to have some kind of method or service in here. If it's 0, we do the insert. Otherwise, we display a warning message. So we can put the warning message in here. It's going to be a Syncfusion predefined dialog. And the code for that, for this one, is this. And what I'm doing here is declaring a string called warning header and a string called warning message, and then giving each a value, and then putting those into the Syncfusion predefined dialog box there. When we're updating an existing city, we've got something exactly analogous. So let me change what we've got here with some revised code. So we're going to carry out a check for duplicates, establish what the duplicates is, and if it's 0, we do the insert. Otherwise, we'll display a message in this format. So again, we've got a string called warning header and warning message, and then we're displaying them in the dialog here. So that leaves declaring the count of the existing cities and also establishing what that is. So to start with, let's declare the count of existing cities, and that's just an integer. And we may as well put that in the usual place at the top of the code. And I'm setting it to 0. I did have second thoughts about this and wondered whether I ought to declare it and give it a default value of, for example, 99, but I don't think there's any danger of us getting an incorrect value here. So next we've got to, so now we need to establish what the count of existing cities is. And for that we'll need a controller, a service, and an interface. So we'll start off by looking at the controller, which is down here under the server project, under controllers. And we've already got some controllers in here that look as if they're doing more or less what we want, except we haven't got any that will count the number of records. So let's put it in here. It doesn't really matter where you put it, but the code is this. So it's a get, and the root is going to be API city, and then the country ID and the city name, because we want to only look for city names for the same country. So if we have two similarly named cities for different countries, we don't care. So this is for the count cities for insert, and we're passing into that the country ID and the city name, and the parameters are country ID and city name, and the SQL is select count, which counts the records, from city, where the uppercase city name equals uppercase the parameter being passed in, and the country ID equals the country ID part being passed in. Then we're using the usual IDB connection and SQLite connection, and here I'm declaring an integer called duplicates, and that's awaiting con query single async. It's of type integer, and then we're passing in the SQL command and the parameters, and it's returning the number of duplicates. Notice here we've got query single async. That's unlike up here where we're just getting the cities. Where we're only getting a single value returned, we can use query single async. I'll put a link in the description to an article with a discussion on this that I found that could be quite interesting. So that's for the insert. We need something similar for update. And for update, we also need to take into account the city ID of the record that's currently being edited. So let me put the code in here for that. And as you can see, it's very similar, except we've now got the city ID as part of the path, and we're passing in the city ID as one of the parameters, and the SQL is counting the number of records where the city name is the same as the city name being passed in. The country ID is the same as the country ID, but we're excluding the current city. And then the rest is exactly the same. So that's the controller. Now we need to look at the city service. And we need a couple of new services in here. So I'm going to put them here. So count cities for insert, and we're awaiting the get from JSON async and then that route that we declared in the controller. And similarly, count cities for update. We have this code, again passing in the city ID as well, and the route including the city ID. One last thing, we need to have a look at the city service. And we need to enter two new interfaces here for both the counts. Let's have it in here. That's the counting cities for the insert. And we'll have the one for editing. So almost exactly the same, except for the parameters being passed in. Let me just check the index again. No errors, apparently. But we do need to enter here. So the count of existing cities equals something, and that something is this. And I'll uncomment it. So count of existing cities is await city service, count cities for insert, and I've forgotten a bracket. And we have a similar one for when we're editing. Get rid of the comment. And that looks fine. So we're counting the cities, existing cities. If it comes back as 0, we can do the update. Otherwise, we issue a warning message. So let's save everything and run it. So if we try adding a duplicate city, let's choose France and try adding Paris again. We can't do that. It says it already exists. However, we should be able to go to another country, such as the United States, and add Paris. And we can. If we go back to France for a second, add another one, we'll call it Rouen. Works correctly. If I now select that and edit it and try changing it to Paris, it says we can't do it. So all that seems to be working correctly. There's just one last thing before we leave this, and that is that in an earlier stage of developing this, I had some very peculiar behavior of the enter key. And if I can reproduce that now, if we go to here and I comment out the cancel button, or comment out the cancel button. So all we've got is a submit. Now run it. Select Norway, select add, and I'll enter Oslo. And I'm going to press carriage return rather than clicking save. And lo and behold, we get 4 of them. Part of that is the display. I think there are only 2 in the database. So if we refresh and look at Norway, we've only got 2. But it's very worrying regardless. The way around that, I don't think we've got the problem, but the way around that is we reinstate our cancel button, is to put this line in, is to put a hidden submit button. Now we still need that commented out. We run it now. And I select Norway again. Let's get rid of one of these Oslos. And try clicking add and Oslo. I'm going to press carriage return. And it says I can't do it. So I'm a bit stuck now because I've also got rid of the close dialog button up at the top here. But I suppose I could enter something else and then get out of it that way. So that was a very peculiar finding. But as I say, by putting in this hidden submit button, we get around that problem. But I much prefer the use of a cancel button anyway. There's no harm in leaving that in there. I don't think that's going to cause a problem. I'll put a link in the description to a number of articles I found helpful during the development of this particular video. And I'll also put a slide at the end here so you can also see them on screen. We've only really got a little bit of tidying up to do, and we'll leave that for the next video. Thank you very much for watching this. The next one will be coming along fairly soon. Thank you.